Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Logistics Executive TV. I'm joined today by a young lady who has got a significant background, both from a corporate background, where she's been consulting for some years now to tier one organisations. She's also a very strong community advocate. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Kate Esiche. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kim. I'm really delighted to be here and excited to talk to you about neuro inclusion and neurodivergence. Because of my own personal experience, I have skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to hear all about that and share some of that from us as well. But look, I always like our guests to give us a little bit about their background. How did you get into the practice area that you have?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kim, for the opportunity. Yes, I love academia, and it's really given me some great insights to how our minds work. My own journey started in neurodivergence 5 years ago when my children were both diagnosed with autism and ADHD. One has both. And at the time, I was told by the professionals who did the diagnosis to go away and to learn as much as possible because there's no intervention, there's no therapy, and there's very little support. So you, as a parent, have to become your child's greatest advocate. So I went away, I
Yep.
took them at their word, and I did a lot of research and digging into autism and ADHD in particular, but broadly around neurodivergence, just to understand more about it, to help me get my head around it, my husband to get his head around it, and then use that knowledge to into my professional consultancy. So I now support organizations to help them understand neurodivergence, and also how it presents or how it can present in a workplace setting.
Awesome. Well, it's an incredible journey and hats off to you because I know about your work ethic because I've spoken to you previously about the amount of exercise that you make sure that you
Yes.
get. You make me feel very, very guilty. But
Yeah.
look, and yeah, of course, neurodivergence has got nothing to do with any particular industry or any particular community group. From the nearly 25 years since we've been in business, we've had a whole range of folks with neurodivergent conditions, and in the business, well, currently in our business, we have a number of people with various elements of neurodiversity, and
Yeah.
it all makes for an interesting life.
It really does. And you've hit the nail on the head there. It makes for an interesting life. And neurodiversity relates to everybody in the human population. We're all neurodiverse. There's no such thing as a typical human being. We all think differently. You and I will learn differently and will consume information in different ways. And we'll also communicate differently. So neurodiversity exists across the entire human population, but neurodivergence relates specifically to conditions like autism, like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. There are so many,
Yep.
but the core ones are autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. They're the ones that are most well known
Sure.
about. And yeah, there's so much benefits that can be got from neurodivergence taken from individuals with these neurotypes. But you have to understand neurodivergence in order to harness those skills and talents. It's not a case of, we'll take all the good stuff, we'll take the creativity, we'll take the innovation, we'll take the hyper focus
Yep.
and the deep focus, and we'll just ignore and disregard everything else. You can't operate in that way. In order to get those wonderful things and take advantage of those brilliant traits, you have to understand those individuals and what they need and their requirements in order to get the best from them. That's
Sure.
the, that's the hard bit.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I guess, I mean, again, I've always had a lot of folks around me with various neurodivergent situations going on to one degree or another. I mean, we talk openly in the business from time to time about who's who's where on what spectrum,
Yeah.
just in general conversation, because of reactions one might have about something. And I guess the good thing these days is, compared to when you and I were, and I was a few generations ahead of you, but when we were kids, there was no real discussion, recognition of
No.
neuro. And these days, of course, we have Richard Branson, who is a really strong
Yes.
proponent, being highly dyslexic and a very strong proponent and supporter there. We've got Elon Musk, who's autistic
Yep.
himself, and I think he's got one or two autistic kids as well. And I guess
Does.
if we all reflect, we all know somebody who's in the space, one place or another. What I wanted to a little bit about was in the workplace. Now, you've done an amazing thing, and you've committed yourself to becoming a specialist, a practicing person in the space of consulting to organisations to help them understand and better leverage folks with
Yeah.
neurodiverse situations. So, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got these celebrities who are now coming out. There's a lot more openness and discussion around
Mm.
neurodivergence. I think Kanye West is the latest to
Yep.
declare that he's received a diagnosis for autism, but it's usually in a negative light. So, someone's done something wrong.
Mm.
He's paraded his wife semi-naked or whatever it was at an award ceremony,
Yeah.
and then they've brought autism into it. And I think that that's slightly disingenuous, because
Yeah.
regardless of the way he behaves, he's autistic.
Yeah.
That's a diagnosis, and whether or not he has good or bad intentions is kind of aside from that. What usually happens is people will connect autism to behavior. And yes, of course, it does have behaviors and traits, but it doesn't mean that you're everything that you do and say relates to your autism. You are an individual aside from your autism. And there's
Yeah.
different schools of thought around this. So some people, talk about autism very much as an identity. They wear it as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
I'm autism, and autism is me. Whereas I take a different approach. You've got an individual who has their own personality, their own culture, their own upbringing, their own style of being a human. And then they've got the autism as well alongside that. And of course, each side will affect the other. But, I think the overarching, the most pertinent part of a human being is the things I mentioned aside from the condition. So if you break your leg, you're not a broken leg. And I'm not equating autism with a broken leg. I'm just saying, if you've got a condition which is physical,
Yeah.
you wouldn't say that that was you. You would
Right.
say that you're managing, with your leg and all the rest of it. And it is different, because once you're autistic, you can't mend that. You can't change that. And you wouldn't want to mend it, and you wouldn't want to change it. At least, most people I interact with, don't want to change that about themselves.
Yeah.
But it's still only one aspect of you as a human being. And
Sure.
so many leaders, managers, HR in organizations do see it as a negative.
Mm.
And recruiters and talent acquisition too, they will, there's research being done into this, they will exclude neurodivergent people from the candidate process as soon
Oh,
as
for
they
sure.
discover.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a huge proportion of them that just get swiped out if they disclose, or if they manage to get to interview stage and they present in a discussion like you and I are having now on a Zoom call or a Teams call. They start doing certain things like waving their fingers in front of their eyes, which is a very common trait of autism. It's called stimming.
It is.
And
Yeah.
it's a regulatory behavior that helps them to calm themselves down. It could be also a show of joy and happiness, as well as anxiety and stress. They
Mm-hmm.
don't understand that. So, organizations will automatically assume that that's going to be a negative thing. And that's why I say about going through that layer of understanding in order to get to the other side. Because if you acknowledge that, yes, there will be some traits which are unfamiliar, then you can get to the good stuff around the hyper focus and the creativity and the innovation. And it took me years like literally years to understand that. I don't get me wrong, I was no expert from day one. I had to go through some really tough learnings in order
Yep.
to get to where I am today. And it's the same with managers. And that's why I'm such a great advocate of supporting organizations, because I know what it's like when you don't know. If you don't know, then you don't know what you don't know. If you don't know, then you're always going to perceive something unfamiliar as something negative. And we all know that that's not the case.
Yeah, I love the terminology and the framework that you just used to talk about having a broken leg or a physical condition.
Yeah.
And that's such an important understanding point. It really triggered me then because most people will acknowledge a physical disability or
Yes.
an injury or whatever way you want to look at it, but they won't look at those things from a neurological point of view.
Yeah.
And it's so important to understand that, right? Um,
Exactly.
so and so talk to me a little bit about some of the data, some of the research, some of the stats that are around, because this is not a sidebar issue in our society, in our community, in our businesses, in our relationships. It's the front and
Yeah,
center
exactly.
factor.
So
So
across
yeah,
the globe, we have 15 to 20% diagnosed as neurodivergence. That includes all the conditions I mentioned about previously: ADHD, autism, dyslexia, 15 to 20%. So it's not a small number we're talking about. And of those 15 to 20% who are diagnosed, there are around 70 to 80% unemployed. So those are adults over the age of 18 are not currently working, 70 to 80%. That's in the UK. And also the numbers are very similar in the US too. So you're talking about a significant waste of talent and skills and knowledge, completely going to waste just because
yep,
there's this lack of understanding and awareness, um,
yep,
and no real willingness to overcome the negative side of
yep,
neurodivergence in order to get to the good stuff. Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah, it's yeah, thanks for sharing that insight because it's understanding the depth of the issues and that this is day-to-day stuff as is any other physical, as I said, physical condition, then
yeah,
neurological conditions are just so much with us. Um, uh, I've come across people, and even quite recently, and quite often I've found that a lot of people don't actually want to acknowledge themselves. And particularly,
yeah,
I'm thinking of folks with ADHD and also a dyslexia. And of
yeah.
course, so when you go into a company, is identification and making it okay for folks to be able to acknowledge where they are neurodivergent? Is that part of it?
Yeah, exactly. That's a pivotal piece of the puzzle. If you cannot feel comfortable acknowledging and disclosing your neurodivergence, then you can't really get very far. There's no legal requirement, at least in the UK, to disclose neurodivergence. You don't have to. Of course, sometimes things give it away, behaviors, etc., but they are considered to be um, you know, they're described in other ways. So, for example, if someone isn't great with social interaction, or they prefer to work alone, they could be considered a loner or an individual contributor, someone who is not a team player, things like that, or challenges with scheduling and making times of meetings will be considered as disorganized or a bit scatty or sometimes even incompetent. And
Mm,
it's
mm,
interesting what you mentioned about ADHD, because the amount of people who are now being diagnosed in adulthood is increasing exponentially. And it's usually watch what happened to me is when my children were diagnosed, they held up a mirror to my own traits because I thought,
mm.
oh, I'm seeing these behaviors. It must come from somewhere. I also
Yep.
behave in similar ways. Perhaps, I'm the source of that neurodivergence. So I've not formally disclosed. I've not formally, sorry, been diagnosed,
Mm.
but I suspect strongly that I do have ADHD.
Yep.
But last year in April in the UK, we had a massive shortage. It was a global one, actually, of ADHD drugs. So many ADHDers who were working couldn't get hold of their medication. And I know this myself because my son was on medication last year. He's not on it anymore. And I went round half of North London,
I saw that on
chemist to chemist.
BBC. Yeah, I
Yeah, it was
saw this going
terrible.
on.
It was
Yeah.
awful. You just couldn't find the drugs, and it was a variety of drugs. It wasn't just one or two.
Mm.
And then what happened is a lot of ADHDers lost their jobs because they couldn't do their work. They couldn't function without their medication.
Yep.
And people just sort of assumed it was okay. There was this sort of resignation. Oh, well, they've lost their jobs. And I was really astonished by that. I thought, surely, you could put in place some measures to support them until they can get
Mm.
hold of their
Mm.
medication. It's like what I was saying to you before. If someone, couldn't walk for whatever reason, you'd never see them losing their job because of that. The ramp wasn't working or whatever. Sorry. You
Yeah.
can't come into the office, therefore you know, you're off.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happened to ADHD is instead of putting together a plan whereby you would have a discussion with them and say, what is it that you can do without your medication? You feel confident doing without your medication. Let's try and focus on that element of your work until, we can get you back on board. There's ways
Yeah.
you can mitigate every challenge, but you've got to have the right mindset. And a lot of, managers just don't have that.
Yeah. Now, these analogies that you're using are really hitting home with me, I've got to say, Kate. Out of everything we're talking about today, about the
Yeah.
whole thing with neurology back to physicality, it is so simple, and yet we're not wired normally to think that way. And this is
No.
where this whole exclusion versus inclusion takes place in the workplace, in the community, in relationships, and one thing and another. I mean, you hit me again when you were talking about ADHD and how you consider that you maybe ADHD probably are yourself. And as we talked about at the top of the off camera, I've been talking openly for the last 20 odd years that I must be ADHD, and I've never been diagnosed, and I'm quite
Mm.
open to promote that because I'm never happy unless I'm doing 20 things at once, and
Right.
I'll usually forget five of them. But I mean that's just
Yes.
part of it being on. And a lot of people who are ADHD and autistic are really rugged entrepreneurs. They like to
Yes,
do
they do.
startups and they'll take risks, even to run into a brick wall while you're doing it. And I've done that a few times.
Yeah.
Uh, but so and there's all these special elements that people with various situations or conditions and neurodiversity or neurodivergent situations that will take a lot more risks. And I don't know
Yeah.
whether you find that.
Yeah, totally, totally. Like I said to you, it brings so much benefit to my life anyway. You said earlier,
Mm.
I'm constantly exercising, running, swimming, Pilates, gym, lifting weights, walking, hiking, cycling. I'm always moving. And as a result, I've never had a problem with my weight. I'm a very healthy human being, and I've instilled the same, philosophy and mindset
Yep.
in my family. My children, they're also very healthy as a result of my activities. And like you said, the world of entrepreneurship is filled with neurodivergence. We are here in our abundance. It's not like suddenly we just rucked up out of
Yeah.
nowhere and we're aliens invading the earth, as we all know what a certain US president is saying at the moment about neurodivergence and how, suddenly the numbers have increased. Is there something in the water? Is something going wrong? We've always existed. And like you said earlier, those people were considered slow or, unable to function in
Mm.
a school environment. But all it took was for a diagnosis, and then those sort of interventions to be put in place to enable them to access the learning that everyone else was accessing.
Sure. Well, it just springs to mind that we talk about people of dysfunction or
Yeah,
handicapped people or anything like this. I mean, one thing that's always been very clear to me in the UAE is that there is no such word as handicapped when talking about people who would be considered disabled in any other community or country or society.
yeah,
Here it's people of determination. And this country is very, very proud that the terminology is always people of determination. There's even a government area for a department promoting people of determination. So, I mean, I think
fantastic.
it's just verbalizing, but we are what we talk about and what we become. So, I think it's very
Exactly.
important.
I mean, and there's two schools of thought. There are many neurodivergent people who self-advocate for themselves as disabled. They say they are disabled and they're happy to categorize themselves in that way. But many
Yep.
people do not consider themselves to be disabled. They consider themselves to be autistic, differently abled, a specific neurotype, but not related to, physical impairment or mental impairment. They just consider their minds to work in different ways. So there are different schools of thought about whether autism, neurodivergence is a disability or not. I don't think it is a disability. And then having said that, there are co-occurring conditions. So you will get autistic people who have learning difficulties. So it's not black and white, it's very grey.
Yep, absolutely. What is an individual? Well,
Exactly.
I suppose if you were from a recruitment perspective, would you recommend that people identify where they are neurodiverse and to highlight the various elements of speciality about themselves in a CV, or would you say that's not something necessarily put into a resume?
It's really hard because no, most people wouldn't put it into a resume. They may outline it verbally during a
Yeah,
discussion. So, on a one-to-one basis, they may feel comfortable with the recruiter talking about their neurodivergence. But I'd say the vast majority wouldn't do it because they'd be afraid of being removed from the hiring process.
mm,
Um, it's a good point, though, with the celebration that's going on, the self-advocacy, I think that will become more and more common, and especially if you've got a recruiter from an organization that is already neuro-inclusive. So you've got companies like Google, like EY, Ernst& and Young, like Microsoft, who are already centers of excellence around
yeah,
neurodivergence, and they actively hire
yep,
neurodivergent people.
sure,
And if you are neurodivergent, you're more than welcome, probably more welcome than you would be if you were neurotypical, even, especially if you have specific skills.
sure.
Um, so those
Okay.
tech organizations like Microsoft are full of neurodivergent people. I think I spoke to you previously and I said 15%, sorry, 50, half
Yeah,
of
yeah.
IT workers identify as
Oh, that's
neurodivergent.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So if you're an IT
amazing.
worker and you're neurodivergent, you're going to already be surrounded by, a lot of neurodivergence.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, it's such an interesting space. Kate, before we wrap up, I'd just like to put you on the spot to talk to us a little bit about, for a minute or so, about if you're consulting to an organisation, they may be in London where you are or wherever else, and hopefully we can get you out to this part of the world as well at one of the conferences that are coming up here. If you're going into an organisation, how would you pitch how you will the sorts of things that you will imbue into that organization to support HR, to support line management, people on the ground dealing with the staff, whether they be an IT company, a logistics company, an airline, or whatever it might be. What's your pitch? What's the elevator pitch?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I will always look at the holistic approach. So around employee engagement, productivity, innovation, those kind of pillars are what I focus on. Because if you come at many organizations, especially SMEs that don't have DEI departments or L&D departments, learning and development departments, they don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the resource to be able to look at inclusion, specifically neuro inclusion. But when you look at inclusion and you look at diversity, they enable all of those things.
Okay.
productivity,
Love
employee
it.
engagement, efficiency. So I come at it through that angle. If you're talent acquisition or your recruitment, I come at it from the angle if you want the best candidates with the best skills and talents, you have to understand neuro inclusion. You have to be inclusive in your hiring process. So that's the lens through which I operate. And in terms of the solutions I offer, it's primarily training for people managers, because we know that the everyday employee experience, you will know as well as I have, having been in the corporate world for as long as we have, that the experience that you have as an employee is shaped primarily by your line manager, by your supervisor, by your team leader.
Sure.
If you've got a
Okay.
good relationship with that person, you're going to have a good time at work. If you don't have a
Yeah.
good relationship, then you're not. Simple as that. So I always go at it through training people managers in mindset, understanding, awareness on how to lead inclusively from a neuro inclusive perspective, how to understand your neurodiverse team. So it's not new. You're not saying
Yeah.
that suddenly you're going to bring something different into their team. They're already there and they're probably misunderstood. So the first thing I do is change that mindset to the opportunity rather than the negative.
Brilliant. It does not surprise me one iota that you are the successful speaker that you are at
Well,
conferences
thank
and
you.
conventions, because you really know how to deliver a message, Kate. I really appreciate
Thank you
your
so
time.
much.
I really appreciate the insights. I mean, this is a journey. We're going to want to stay in touch. This is neurodivergence is such a big part of life and
Yeah,
business,
really
and we
is.
really, the more we talk about it, the better it's going to be. Really appreciate your time again. So, my perspective, Kate Esiche, legendary neuro inclusion consultant and absolute fitness fanatic.
Yes.
Thanks so much for sharing again. How do people get hold of you, Kate?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. They can reach me on LinkedIn. You can find me very easily, Kate Asiche. You can see the spelling of my name on the notes. And you can also find me at wheretolookcoms.co.uk, which is my website.
Good on you, Kate. Thanks again for joining us and all the best ahead.
Thank you, Kim.